So you should have gotten a note saying that this is being recorded. All right, so let me start by introducing my friend and colleague, Nadja Schott, who's away over in Germany right now, 6 time zones from the East Coast, and 9 time zones from David in San Francisco. She's going to talk to us about a paper which hopefully you've all read, but she's going to talk to us about that. I'm going to turn this over to her. She's going to share her screen. We will ask you to put your questions into the chat box, and then at the end we'll moderate those from there on, okay? And I will say, I don't know if your Zooms are doing what my Zooms are doing, but AI is now transcribing them, so speak clearly. No, I'm only kidding. But it is funny. I just read one today, and you can just go right through the whole session. But I did end my meeting with Pax Vobiscum, which is what I usually say to my class, which is peace be with you. And AI thought it was something like some scum thing or something, Pax Scumbong or something. It was like, it apparently doesn't understand some words in English. So anyhow, all right, Nadja, over to you, and you share your screen, please.
Thanks a lot. And hopefully the AI will not mess up too much with my English, or maybe it's my English which will mess up with the AI. So apologies before that. But yeah, thank you for all coming. I'm sharing my screen somewhere. Here it is. Okay. Yeah, the title you might remember is Associations Between Object Control Skills and Cognitive Functions in Boys, Younger and Older Men. Why only men? I'm so sorry, but we evaluated not only throwing and catching, but also kicking. And for a long time, it was forbidden in Germany for women to play soccer. And so the age groups we were interested in, they were not allowed to play soccer. And because we didn't want to hurt anyone, we decided to get started with just men. So apologies for that. At some point, we hopefully can examine women as well. So as I tried to summarize here, there are actually 2 articles. So the first part I will talk about is the one on the bottom right side. It's just about the object control skills across the lifespan, and then I will switch to the other. And maybe I even have time. I just got new data. I just analyzed not only about static situations of throwing, catching and kicking, but also dynamic. And we wanted to evaluate the change from a static situation where you just stand and throw a ball to a game-like situation where you throw and catch the ball while you're running. So, but we'll see how it goes. Why is it an important question? We know that we face demographic change. More and more people will get older and older, but that doesn't change a thing in terms of what do we want to do with our leisure time? We want to play. If you were a player all your life, like me, I'm a team handball player, I want to still do that. The question is, can I do it? Is the level still the same? What does change? Because in Germany, we have a club system, and so we need to make some offers to the club system as well, to the associations, to tell them, yes, you can still have these courses or these classes for older adults playing soccer, soccer, handball, basketball, volleyball, whatever it is. So we wanted to know what is the level actually if we examine older adults compared to children as well as younger adults. And then, of course, we also wanted to relate that to cognitive performance. I'll come to that in a little bit. So if we look at the literature, and we just did that again because it's very interesting because of the dynamic version of our testing, then we typically see that older adults perform worse on many motor tasks than younger adults, although one has to say the tasks examined in older adults are usually gait or something like sit up and stand, maybe the timed up and go test, but not really object control tests. So we don't know really much about that. However, we might or we can see that motor skill learning may help to counteract age-related loss of brain structure, and I come to that a little bit. We see Oh, we saw many studies in children. There are a few now in younger adults and adolescents, especially when we look at the gender or let's say the sex differences between men and women, with usually the same idea that men or boys outperform girls. That is nothing new. From the older studies, we know, looking at process-oriented measures, it's said, or it's printed, that 60% of all girls and boys should arrive at a mastery level around the age of 8 or 9 for object control skills. In studies we had in Germany, we could show that only 30% of girls as well as boys achieve a mastery level around the age of 8 or 9. So something has changed. Maybe ball skills are not as attractive anymore. We have lower numbers, at least in team handball and basketball in Germany. So maybe there's something to it. Maybe it's not played as much anymore in schools. So we don't really know that. Lawson and colleagues, David Stodden is part of that group. They published one study looking at adults, younger adults, as well as middle-aged adults. So they were around 45, 50, 55. So that is only one study we were able to identify. And there are a few studies from Kathy Williams from the 90s. This is more or less the same group she was examining, a rather a small group, and they looked at throwing, nothing else. So most of these studies we see in the literature focus on throwing, some on catching, especially when we look at children with DCD. There are some studies from Ustil who published on that, but not much more than that. So our idea was in this first study to look just at age effects across the lifespan and how they change qualitative and quantitative parameters across the lifespan. So we examined many children from the first grade, second grade, all through primary school, fourth grade. So in total, we had 78 children. We had younger adults kind of as a benchmark group, and then older adults between the ages of 62 and 79. And as I said before, all men or boys. We measured height, weight, BMI, etc., etc. There was nothing special to the group. Of course, there are some significant differences, but nothing out of, if you compare that to norm data, we are pretty much in the norm data for height, weight, body mass index. So what did we do? There are published developmental sequences from the older studies from Robertson, Langendorfer, Halverson, Langendorfer, and so on for catching as well as throwing. We had to modify the throwing part a little bit because in Germany we don't really play baseball, and that changes the start, especially of the throwing performance and the stepping performance. So we adjusted that a little. For soccer or for kicking, there was nothing we were really able to identify at the beginning. And because soccer is something we are really fond of in Germany, we said it's about time to look for some developmental sequences or components for soccer. So we had a rather large study. Benny did that, who is a co-author in that paper, with some others to look at what are the main characteristics of kicking. So these are the components we were looking at for process-oriented measures. And for the product-oriented measure, we used a Stalker radar gun, which is pretty good, we have to say. So we had a cage where we hit that radar gun, so it was protected from the ball. And as well, we also collected the number of caught balls. So we had 10 trials overall for all the different age groups, and then we counted or gave you a percentage feedback how many balls were caught. So these were the methods for the first study, and here are the results. So for throwing, the blue bars represent the results for the process-oriented measures. And here we see overall they could range from 0 to 15 points they were able to achieve. If you look first at the benchmark, the younger adults, we see not all of them reach the mastery level. On the contrary, only 80% reach the mastery level. And so we see they achieve about 12 points out of 15. The orange bars represent the velocity of the ball, the throwing ball. And we see on average, the average velocity was around 16 meters per second. The interesting part about that is if we look at the development, although that's cross-sectional data, we can see with increasing age, we see the increasing quality of the performance, although only they achieve on average 10 points. So they are far away from mastery levels. Our older adults, they achieve the same level on average than the 9 to 10-year-olds, an age where Langendorfer would say that is where kids should achieve a mastery level in, or not all of them, but most of them, a mastery level. And in addition, we looked at the correlation between product and process measures, which are depicted here above the bars. So we have rather high correlations between process and product, but not for the younger adults, but again for the older adults. And if you look at the results published by Logan, we see for the developmental sequences for 4 or let's say 7 to 8-year-olds, we see a correlation of 0.46, and for the somewhat older ones, 71. So we somewhere around this range. There's not much difference. So we see we can confirm the results we see from a few other studies, but not that many. If the TGMD is a good representative of process-oriented measure, I will leave that question maybe for later. If we look at kicking, then we see a development which is very much a part of the German culture, I would see. You see that the kids, even around the age of 6 to 7, show a level which is almost the same than the 9 to 10-year-olds, but that has something to do with German culture. Boys here in Germany, often enough, they go to a sports club, a soccer club, around the age of 3, 4, 5. So they start early on with some very soccer-specific training. And therefore, we see a pretty good level already in the younger ones. Remember, these are only boys. But then we see development, maturation, when we look at the kicking velocity. So the technique is not too bad. Even in the younger adults, it's not really changing too much. But we see here a clear sign of maturation. Boys get taller, stronger. They can kick with more force. And then if you look at the older adults again, we see again the decrease in force, muscle changes. And remember, these are older adults between 62 and 79 years of age. I would have loved to have more older adults because it seems there is a biological cutoff around 75, and then it gets much harder to maintain muscle force output compared to the group between 60 and 75. But we had 20, and we were lucky enough to have these, so we're pretty happy about what we see. But this is a clear, I think, relationship for the cultural background we are living in. If we look at catching, then again, we have here the blue bars represent the process-oriented results between 0 and 10 points. We see an increase in the adults. We see very good performance across all subjects we were measuring. And interesting enough, there's almost no difference between older adults and the younger adults. So the process-oriented measures, they're almost on the same level than younger adults. So if they learned how to catch a ball, they can do it. Of course, there's a large part to it, which is anticipation. And that is one of the cognitive parts of this skill, which is probably much better developed and maintained in older adults compared to the children. In terms of the caught balls, we see that is a very hard skill for the 6 to 7-year-olds. So if the ball is not flying directly at them, a lot of them, especially because they are still trying to trap the ball rather with the body than catching it with the hands, it's very hard for them to secure the ball. And we see then a increase in performance, but still on average, even the 9 to 10-year-olds catch only 6 out of 10 balls. So that seems to be a very tricky task, and anticipation, as we know, has something to do with the growth spurts, especially in the prefrontal cortex, I would say, and probably there is kind of a relationship to it, but we didn't really measure attention with the youngest one or with the 2 younger groups. So how can we interpret these first results? We did another study. I did that together with Nancy Getchell, and we looked at children with DCD and what happens in DCD, developmental coordination disorder, and tried to apply the degrees of freedom setup from Bernstein and the learning stages from 1, 2, and 3, and try to look at throwing patterns in children with DCD, and if we can relate them to these different stages, learning stages, which were defined by Bernstein with the freezing and defreezing of degrees of freedom. And in children with DCD, we clearly saw a lower number of exploiting the different degrees of freedom, which would still allow for a successful throw. And in a way, we see that in older adults again. So they try to look for more stability versus instability. So they wouldn't make that many steps, or they wouldn't turn their upper body as much as younger people do that. They're still able to participate in ball games, but of course, we would need to adjust the way how we provide the number of players, the field size, maybe the height of a basketball ring, etc., etc. So to adjust for their reduced degrees of number of degrees of variability or degrees of freedom. For me, motor learning is kind of the control over the degrees of freedom. And it seems that older adults choose a lower number of different types of throwing patterns. So in terms of how do they combine arm, trunk, leg, and whatever movement you want to look at, depending on catching, throwing, or kicking, they reduce that, but they're still able to be successful. And in children, we see more or less the same. They freeze the degrees of freedom as well, but learn, of course, how to defreeze them. So that was our first idea about how to look at these object control tasks. And then, of course, we were looking at how can we explain our results, not only with motor learning control theories, but of course also what do we know about the relationship of motor skills and cognition? And probably you all heard about Adele Diamond and her 2000 paper that motor skills and cognition, they have something to do with each other. If you look in the literature and look at different systematic reviews, meta-analysis, single studies, etc., I tried to summarize the main results here. And then we see in kindergarten children, if they look at object control at all, mainly they look at inhibitory control or inhibition. And for example, here's a study with 4-year-olds, and their relationship between cognition and inhibition is 0.26. Not so high. There's a meta-analysis by Gendrotra. I'm not sure about the spelling, the pronunciation. I'm so sorry. Hopefully it's not too awful. They conducted a meta-analysis, and they looked at object control and inhibition, object control and working memory, as well as cognitive flexibility. And if you look at the R's here, not so convincing that there's much to it. A recent analysis with many studies, more than 30, which is pretty good for that question. They also looked at locomotion as well as object control and the relationship with inhibition, working memory, the classic one, cognitive flexibility. They reported some pooled effect sizes. Again, rather small effects, small relationships. And then if you look at middle-aged and older adults, there's one study by Van der Willig, pretty recent one, not study, again, a systematic review. They looked at 45 to 90-year-olds. And what we see, of course, there are no studies looking at cognition and motor skill performance per se. What we know or what is looked at quite a bit is gait. That is what, or gait, mobility. These are the main terms in terms of motor skill in older adults. So that is examined quite a bit, either alone as just walking or in relationship with dual tasks. So you walk, for example, a 10-meter pathway and you count backwards in threes, for example. And if you do that, typically, we see an overall decline in motor and cognitive function, specifically cognitive functions relating to the prefrontal cortex. But what they couldn't show was that there was an overall cognitive function decline preceding motor function or vice versa. So the relationship of motor and cognitive function is not really clear cut. But the other issue here is that we are talking about cross-section studies. There are almost no longitudinal studies really following up what is driving what. One could imagine that in kindergarten children, we would see that motor performance would drive cognitive development. And then after the first growth spurt, around 2.5, 3 years, we would see maybe a switch that cognitive performance drives motor performance. However, there is no real study confirming one way or the other way. So we don't know anything about that. However, I'm not saying I present any longitudinal data. I'm so sorry. We try to explain why we think that there is a relationship. When you are in that field of research for quite a while, you see a lot of different frameworks, models, and this one is a combination of different frameworks. I work in gerontology, but also I'm interested in children and the development of children. And in older adults, there's a very famous theory, the scaffolding theory of cognitive performance. And then there is a motor learning model from Wren. And of course, there is this rather large literature by now about embodied cognition. And we thought about bringing together all the work we do here in Germany and saying that there are probably 3 parts of how to explain motor behavior at the end of the day, which you see here at the right side. So if we talk about behavior, one part is the part we see, the motor performance part. We measure process or product-oriented performance. We could do that very much lab-based with biomechanical assessment. We could do field tests, etc., etc. But 2 very interesting parts are the motor learning potential part. So if you look at a normal curve, then of course, most of the people will be somewhere under the big part of the bell. But we have Olympic people participating in Olympic Games, and we have also people who are rather troubled by motor skill execution. So where they're at, what is their starting point really, and how steep, and that is the part we will see here, how is their change of rate when you look at learning? So there will be these kids, you say them, give them one instruction and they say, oh yeah, got it, and they do it. And there are other kids who can do whatever you want to. It's like they're not getting it. Maybe it's you, they get another teacher and it works, so it's a wording. But really, if you look at the rate of change, that is a really interesting part. And then on the other hand, we want to explain what we see. So of course, we look at something like nature nurture. What's the kid coming in with? What is the life course experience? What are the peers? What is the setup I'm growing up in? We know that there are many studies looking at fitness and cognition. This is probably the most rich literature we have right now. And of course, we want to know here in the center, what does movement have to do with brain structure and function? What is the relationship between motor skill learning and changes in the brain? So most studies right now, they look at fitness and brain. But of course, it would be more interesting to look at motor skill change, brain changes through motor skill learning. Which is a lot harder to do. We have lots of motor sequence learning studies and looking at brain changes, which is not that easy if you're in a scanner, but still. For us in the field, it's interesting to look, for example, at something like motor imagery. How does motor imagery influence motor performance, and how, because motor imagery is of course largely based on working memory performance, which we see here, how do they interact and what is the level of change? The same is true for perception, the knowledge, affordances. And if there is such a wide complex of different structures explaining motor skill learning, it's clear that a term like motor competence might be not enough when we just look at motor skill. So motor skill, motor performance is a lot more than just the execution part. We need to know more about knowledge, how people perceive different stimuli from the environment to explain at the end what we see here. So there's quite a bit to understand. And as we have seen before, there are not that many studies looking at the relationship of object control skills and cognition. So we included now a cognitive measure, which is the trail making test. And the trail making test is a pretty old test, which was originally developed to look at traumatic brain injury. This one, the original one, has two parts to it. The part one, the A part, looks at more or less information processing speed. There's a lot more to it, but it's more or less information processing speed. And then the trail making, in that A version, you have to connect the numbers from 1 to 25 in an ascending order as quickly as possible without making any errors. In the trail making test B, which measures more or less cognitive flexibility, working memory, you connect the numbers 1 to 13 and the letters A to L in an ascending alternating order. So it's from 1 to A, 2 to B, 3 to C, which gives you a pretty good idea how good someone is on working memory actually and cognitive flexibility. In the field, this one is used now many times, and there are some really nice papers from Timothy Salthouse what this test actually measures. You can create some ratios between A and B to look at what changes if you make it harder. And nowadays we see plenty of digital versions trying to reflect that test, because of course, if you just look at the overall time and the number of errors, that might be not enough. We have an own version, or we created a version where we can look at the time in the circles and between the circles. And we're pretty good now in distinguishing people with Parkinson, comparing them to healthy controls. We can distinguish people with and without MCI from each other. So the digital versions work pretty well. And that confirms that this test is a really good one if you really disentangle the different measurements you can take with that. Okay. So if we try to summarize, first of all, the data, what I've done here is I transferred all my data from throwing, kicking, and catching, as well as the trail making test, into set scores to compare them with each other. And if we start with the first one, that would be the quality, so the process-oriented measure. And we see what we expect to see. We see an increase to the group of the 20 to 30-year-olds and a slight decrease in older adults, which is still above the mean. If we look at the product-oriented measure, we see that especially here the maturation kicks in, and in young adults we see quite a steep increase in throwing velocity and a decrease again in the older adults. Looking at kicking, here we see that result I mentioned before. In Germany, a lot of boys, they start with kicking. That's probably pretty much the same than baseball or football, let's say baseball in the US, and maybe cricket in Australia, and so on and so forth. But we see that the quality is pretty good in boys in Germany, and in older adults. The main issue here why older adults get worse from the look at the process-oriented data is that there's quite a huge decrease in the flexibility in the hip, and that changes quite a bit how they can execute the kicking movement. And that shows again in the kicking velocity, which pretty much follows the line of throwing velocity, but again decreases quite a bit. And if we look at catching, then again we see pretty much the same development and the steep increase till the age of 20 to 30-year-olds. But then, as I said before, they maintain the performance pretty well for the process-oriented variation. If we now look at the trail-making test, it's depicted in green, but it comes up a little different. Again, we see we haven't tested the 6 to 7-year-olds because of A-B letters, rather hard for the kids. So even here, it's more the 8 and 9-year-olds. But they are performing a lot better in the motor skills compared to cognitive skills, but then they show a steep increase in the performance. So in the information processing speed variation, we see a very good performance in the young adults, but then although it's only information processing speed, a rather a steep decrease in performance in the older adults. That is not really like we see it in the other studies, because information processing speed usually doesn't decrease that much in older adults. Of course, there's a variation in the data, but still it was a little surprising that they lost performance that much. And if we look at this dotted line here, which is the representative for the trail making test B, we see that they even perform a little better here, but then it's more or less the same graph. It follows the same lifespan, U-shaped trajectory we would see in a lot of other results. And of course, we looked at some correlation and regressions results. So this is cross-sectional. I just want to highlight that again. And if we look at the correlations between the trail making test A and B and the process and product-oriented measures, catching, throwing, kicking, separated by children, younger adults, and older adults, we see there's almost no correlation for younger adults between process and product-oriented measures, object control skills. But we see quite a number of correlations for the younger kids, as well as the older adults, but mainly to the throwing and kicking performance, not so much about the catching results. But however, that is kind of clear because catching performance remains more or less the same, and we see the same results here in the younger adults, that there are only rather low correlations. If we look at the multiple regression, we did that separately for children, for younger adults, and older adults. We see that for the children in a process-oriented version, the trail making test B explained the process-oriented catching performance. For the product-oriented version, it was exercise and age. For the younger adult, it was exercise. So probably it's all about experience. Exercise means that they are engaged in exercises in clubs. We separately ask them for what do you do in clubs and what do you do on a regular basis in your leisure time outside of the clubs. And we see that in other studies as well, that structured exercises, that is what they get in the clubs. There's a coach and they get regular training and they really work on performance. So experience here, exercise is something which shapes catching, which you need a lot of trials before you get it right, get into the right position. For throwing process-oriented, neither age or cognition was explaining anything for the process-oriented version. But in the product, so the throwing velocity, we see that age in children and the trail making test B explained the performance. In older adults, it was information processing speed, which was a little surprising. And for kicking, again, information processing speed, which could partly have to do with that they had to move a little for kicking the ball and throwing it. So maybe the information processing speed for the right structure of the performance plays a major role. And in the product-oriented one, again, exercise as a representative for experience plays a major role. And in the younger adults, we have these information processing speed again. If we take that together, then we see what we expect. Across the lifespan, there's a U-shaped relationship between motor and cognitive performance. We get better in the motor skill performance as well as the cognitive performance. In Germany, I would say it has a lot to do that we teach exactly that in primary school, if they are lucky. So that's part of the curriculum to teach kicking, throwing, and catching. And in older adults, we see that they don't really have regular experience anymore, but in their youth, they were exposed to kicking and throwing and catching. So the older group, if we look at especially the product-oriented measures, we see that they perform more or less on the level of 9 to 10-year-olds. And we see that the relationship especially is stronger for children and older adults. If we want to provide other courses across the lifespan, of course, it would be good to get the message out older adults can still do it. And we see that in all the master athlete competitions, especially in track and field. But we know that many people would really still like to play soccer or any kind of catching, throwing related sports. But our clubs are still not willing really to go there. They would need to adjust the different games to really look at, versions of the sport where injury is not the major problem at the end of the day. And of course, we would need some longitudinal study. I would like to give a kind of a perspective for the future too. I'll skip that part and give you some examples where we want to look at, where we want to go with that to include older adults a lot more than we do now, as well as children. And I skip that part too. I want to show you something. So I think one major issue we have is that we need more data. The data I showed you, we had 20 people in a group, 30 people in a group. There's a lot of variation in the data because of different experience. The people go to clubs at different ages, or at their time, if I compare 60-year-olds from today or even 80-year-olds, some of them were part of the post-war generation. There were no clubs. So I think that hinders sometimes the results we get. So we need more data from more people. And we know that with the mobile, everyone has that nowadays. That has a video camera. And right now we're working with a company, for example, how to detect data here from a videotape, from a movie, to extract the data and relate that to a specific skill. So here now we can detect this is a volleyball serve with, there are two different versions, one where the ball is really going over the net like a tennis serve, and the other one, which I have no idea what the English word is. So there are different versions, and we can really distinguish. We have now the markers from a video made with a mobile and say, that is the skill. And now we can increase that and say, okay, this is a skill which is still within a norm frame, and that is outside. And that we can do for the different components of the movement. Of course, we need to make a much larger database out of that, but that could be now a living database. So I can feed in data across time, so I can measure secular trends over time, and I can do that for different tasks which might be different in different cultures, because we tend, for example, with the throwing performance, we do that differently in Germany compared to the US. So we can get really an idea about what is maybe out of the norm, what is excellent norm, and feeding into these databases. Now we can collect thousands of data points and increase our knowledge and give teachers a tool how to react maybe to the motor performance in your class. We can do that much better. We can integrate now VR and do projections, so you can go into the proper execution. We show you what you do and what you don't do, because if we don't see that on video or at any other form, typically we don't believe it. So that is one thing we're working on, trying to create all these algorithms to detect performance across different motor skills for children, and of course then older adults as well. Another part we're doing, where this first part here, that is a floor projection version of the trail making test. And now we have a cross-motor version of that test, and we can look again at how long does it take you to make that decision to go from 7 to 8. How long does it take to go between this circle to another one? If you look at Parkinson's disease, where you have issues with tremor, you have Parkinson patients with and without MCI, we can clearly now distinguish several features here, not only how long it takes them to make that decision, but also how do they take turns, the arm swing compared to the leg swing. And we created a game which is based on a similar idea like the trail making test B. And now we can train you and come back to the test and show, yes, you can really improve with it's a very simple structure. It takes a little bit to get there, but we are now able to use this technology and offer it in shopping malls, etc., etc. So far, we can create adaptive interventions. So we can adjust the difficulty of that. We can adjust the trail making test. We don't have to start at 1. We don't have to go from 1 to 2 to 3. We can go from 1 to 4 to 7 and so on and so forth. So we can go from small dogs to bigger dogs to large dogs. So we can create kindergarten children versions. Technology will allow us to use what we already know, but create better versions out of it, get better data, and adapt it to the kids. Jane, you want to say something? Yes.
I just want to be sure you leave them time for asking questions.
Yeah, that's
okay.
The second last.
Okay, sorry.
Slide. Okay. Another thing, and I was talking just about that to Jane yesterday, is this is a multi-touch table. So thousands of people could touch it at the same time and it will detect a touch. And we try to disentangle motor skill execution from knowledge, cognition. And here we created with the computer basic tactical skills. The computer controls 4 players or 3 players. And I have 3 students here controlling 1 player each. And now it's all about gaining the tactical knowledge without being able to dribble a ball, to handle a ball. And when they learn the tactical skills, we focus on one at a time, they go to the gym and execute it. And then we have these kind of VR games where we show that motor cognitive skill training can happen in VR with older adults to do some falls prevention tests. I even have a video about that, but I skipped that so you can ask some more questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Please put your questions in the chat. I have one or two comments. One, I just want to say that the idea of aggregating lots of video was created by Karen Adolph for what's called the Baby Lab. Yeah. And it's actually funded by NSF in the United States, but it's something we might want to think about as we talk about something scaling up the lifespan instead of just baby lab things. And now that we can extract from video of any kind movement data, that's a good thing. Secondly, I just want to commend you for including cognition and motor things together. At Maryland, our lab was called Cognitive Motor Neuroscience Lab because, of course, you can't just say it's a motor lab, kind of thing. So I did want to say one heartening point was I was glad as an old person that I can catch still. That I'm better.
I don't know about you, Jane, but
throw me my keys, I can still do it. It also has to do with interception skills. So when I'm driving my car, it's a good thing that I don't run into things because catching is part of that is interception or not interception. The other thing I was thinking about when I was listening to your talk was I was thinking about all the lifetime sports such as tennis playing and in America anyhow, and golf. Because a lot of people, if you go out on the golf during the day, of course, you'll see a whole bunch of retirees who are all in their 60s, 70s, and some in their 80s, and are all very good at it. But the other way to think about that, and I'm sure that you probably do this in Germany, is playing darts. So the accuracy part of throwing, we do the velocity, we do the way in which you create the movement for maximum impact or velocity, but we're not really focused on the accuracy of the throw or the accuracy of in dart throwing. So I was thinking about something that might go across the continuum, which would be something that would be small, but still have an accuracy component to it. And if you go to a pub, do not play darts with an older guy. He will beat you.
Up to a certain age,
yeah.
Because at some point, the sensations you get from your senses, they get not integrated in the motor imagery version of your skill execution, and they don't match anymore. Mm-hmm. So especially in dart, you have a very brief window of releasing the dart. And if that doesn't match anymore, the sensation, the feedback you get from your arm muscles, from proprioception, then that doesn't match anymore. So at some point, as I said, there seems to be a biological cutoff around 75. If you look at data across different skills, data we have, 75, at least for these generations we have now. Maybe we push that a little, or maybe that...
or maybe not.
Exactly. But that seems to be the window, kind of.
Okay, questions from other people? Okay, I'm waiting for questions you could just raise your hand if you want, maybe, rather than put it in the chat box.
Maybe it was too boring, too clear, too
Yes, Johan's going to go in on this. Go for it, Guy.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a question, Nadja, regarding the chart with the set scores that you've transforming, trying to find patterns across the lifespan. Were they statistically significant, or were they just descriptive tendencies, between the different tests, product versus process oriented and so on?
So you mean the set scores?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, they were, especially if you look at something very experienced like soccer. We see the difference in the development for the children, because that is something they really do in the clubs a lot. So we see in the process measures a difference between catching, throwing, and kicking. Kicking is best in these third, fourth graders. In the older adults, catching was better than the other two, and that was significant. For the cognitive part, we saw differences for
Nadja,
two. Actually, I just looked at motor skill.
I was wondering about whether the differential developments were significant.
Yeah, you see always the difference between the 6 and 7 year olds. That was always significantly different to the young adults and the older adults. But the 9 to 10 year olds were not significantly different to the 20 to 30 year olds in all 6 measures, if you want so.
Okay.
I'll jump in and ask a question if I can.
Thank you, David.
Jane, so thanks, Nadja. That was a fascinating talk, and I really enjoyed reading the papers as well. My question relates to the specificity of the link between motor activity or motor competence and cognition. So whenever I see a significant association between one and the other, I'm always trying to think very specifically in terms of mechanism by which the two might be related. And so with respect to the trial making test and the skills you analyze, to me, it's not intuitively obvious what that link is. And you kind of talked about visual information processing, which seems a little bit too generic for me in terms of explaining why the skills are connected. But I wonder, just thinking about the components of visual information processing, it seems to me a more intuitive link is between, well, a more intuitive mediating factor might be the useful field of view. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that concept or not. It gets used a lot in driving research. Useful field of view is basically how much information can you take in without moving your head or your eyes. How big is that area, basically, is the useful field of view. And it seems to me that's a really critical component of the trial making test, in that the more you can take in of the whole field that you're looking at to see where the numbers are, or the numbers and letters, that's going to be really helpful in connecting them. And same thing with the catching, when it's developing. We know when children are learning to catch, or novices are learning to catch, peripheral vision of the hands seems to be very important. So if the useful field of view incorporates the peripheral vision of the hands, maybe that contributes to the catching performance. Maybe that also contributes to the trial making test as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there to get you thinking more about this, that specificity issue.
Yeah, there are several things one would like to say about. So first of all, we would need to see, where do we see changes in the brain in the motor skill learning studies? What do they relate to? Are there specific changes in functional connectivity? And is that about the processing of visual information, dorsal stream, ventral stream? Where do we see the changes? Where do they perform better? And there are some studies on juggling from Bogdan Dragansky, for example, and they showed that especially in the visuals, and that is exactly what you say, in juggling, I have to have this visual field, this field of vision, which needs to be developed. And we see exactly that relationship of areas related to visual spatial perception, which gets better. Not so much anything in the motor area, but visual spatial perception. That's where we get better in motor learning processes. So that would be exactly what you are saying. However, there are not that many studies looking at that question. Most of them, there are motor sequencing studies. And so you would see improvement in working memory performance. So a little bit of prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But then again, the issue is that if these studies were run, they were in the scanner, so you have only this chance of motor sequence learning. I think we will have a better chance now with FNIRS, not with the deeper parts of the brain to show that, but I think with a full 64 channel cap for FNIRS, we could probably run different motor learning studies now to give us a different perspective in children with a lower visual field, how that develops and how that relates to different functional connectivity setups.
Yeah, the Dragansky juggling study, or study were the ones that came to mind when I was thinking about this.
Yeah, Karen Zenkraft did a similar study, and she looked at younger adults too, not children, not older adults, but she got pretty much the same results. However, I don't know if any studies no, there is one in older adults. They looked at juggling too, but I'm not sure if they did relate it to brain activation.
Okay. Haley, I see you there. Did you have a comment?
I've just been inching toward the screen as David was talking because you all know motor integration is my restricted interest, I suppose. I was thinking about this in the context of autism, and I thought it was interesting you brought up these questions, David, because often we see in autistic people similar differences in sort of catching skill and trail making skills, those types of things. And one of the questions I always have about that population is the tendency toward peering from the periphery instead of foveating things centrally, and how that can really affect visual spatial perception and just the acuity of your available visual field. And I wonder if you have any thoughts, Nadja, on how you think a population with sort of core oculomotor differences that lead to downstream visuospatial processing might be in this equation.
So again, I would relate that to functional connectivity, but if you look at brain activation at the center of field, so what we really focus on, that is such a small area. If you read a book and in the center you read, the reflection on the brain is rather large. Everything which is in the peripheral is rather small in the activation pattern. And if it doesn't really come over a certain threshold, it won't be perceived as something which is important. And if I don't learn to visualize, to focus really on the important part of motor skill execution, so a teacher shows me what to do, but if I don't know where to look at and be very specific, and if we teach motor skills, often we teach many things, and there's the arm, and there's the hip, and then there's the feet. And they don't know where to look for the most important information in that instruction, then they will have overlapping activation patterns probably, which will interfere with the execution. And that will be even worse if they have to communicate with the left and right hemisphere. I think there are some studies looking at the corpus callosum and the connection between the hemispheres, and that there is some issue. So if where and what is not getting really clear information because they're all overlapping, because they're not really looking at something for long enough to get the right information, then we need to instruct only one thing. And maybe we need to start to work with shades or something, to say, okay, that is the focus you have. Don't look left or right, you only look in this field, so that we don't get too many distracting information in the projection of the center of field and the peripheral information.
But I think what Haley is actually raising also is that special abilities can actually lead us to some other ideas about how things work too, by looking at children with, as you've done with DCD, but looking at children with autism. Also, we could open up another window, no pun intended, to how the brain might think these things out. So is that what you were thinking, Haley?
Yeah, and I think my question remains, I don't think we have enough scientific literature to make an assessment on this, but my question remains, are autistic people processing in the brain information from the visual periphery in a way that's fundamentally different from non-autistic people because of their preference for obtaining information that way, because it is lower resolution and less overwhelming? And so I would be interested to think more about that as a solution that you're proposing of, like, you know, sort of forcing somebody to focus on central field of vision or on what's, sort of most important. Because the reason we get that peering behavior in autism is because central field of vision is overwhelming. It's too much visual information. So I don't know if that would work in this particular population as a strategy, as a training tool. It's an interesting thought. I'm just kind of thinking through the layers here.
It's an empirical question. You should try to figure out how to answer it. Okay,
I
I
haven't
don't wanna,
with autism before, but just from brain activation, sensation, perception, action, I would say there's quite a difference in activation patterns between peripheral and center field. And if there's conflicting information, overlapping information, then what do you process? And if we reduce maybe that field, and now that is a suggestion, I was coming from the idea of motor skill learning. For another question, cognitive, whatever, it could be different. But to focus on something, if you exclude the periphery, maybe that helps to focus on that thing you want to really teach.
okay, I'm gonna leave it there. I want to remind us all that our first of all, I want to thank Nadja. Yes, thank you very much. And I think only the one paper is listed on the IMDRC Journal Club. I'll send the second paper over to be posted there in case those of you want to read the first paper as well. Secondly, I want to remind you that if you go to that website, you'll find that December 13th, we're back on Thursday. This was because Nadja teaches her brains out literally on the other day. So this was the day she could do it on. So it'll be back on Thursday and it'll be December 12th. I know we're near exam time. And it's with Claire Martins and her group. And I'll point you to that. I won't report that. But to all of you, particularly the students, if you find a paper in 2024 that you think we should take up for Journal Club in 2025, we are looking for some really good papers. And we have sort of a little bit of a threshold here where we'd like you to be an IMDRC member in order to be able to talk here. But if they're not, then we might be able to convince them to become an IMDRC member. But anyhow, so please be on the lookout for papers that you think would be of interest to those people in the Motor Development Journal Club. That would be great. So I challenge you, Haley students, to look for those papers and pass that on information. Then Haley will look brilliant because she's handing us these papers. And David and Haley and I have sort of this challenge to think this out. And I would actually ask all the others if you have any ideas about this, it would be great. So again, thank you, Nadja. I appreciate you taking the time in your busy schedule and also for doing a very interesting set of data here that's very interesting. Although I'm not sure I like being considered like the old group, but
You're not the old group.
no,
so,
I'm not. Well, I am in the oldest group.
yeah. And that will change soon
And then you
enough.
told me the threshold was 75. Oh no.
Then the threshold will be 90.
Yeah, okay, there we go.
And you're so far away from that.
I know. And I have a lot of friends who are in their 90s and are still going strong and still playing golf, I might add, and tennis. One of my neighbors is, I think she's 90 right now and she plays golf and tennis all
Mini
week.
golf.
She's a role model for all of us. All right, folks.
They're out there. And if there are any questions I can answer, just send me an email and I'm happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on. I'm just waiting for everybody to go off and then I was just going to talk to you. Naomi is still on. Hang on. There we go. Good job. That was very interesting. I'm sorry I didn't get that second paper up on the website. We just had the second of your papers.
No
But
worries.
no, it's good. It was great. It was very